like it when people try to excuse or dismiss bigoted behavior in the older generation by saying things like, they're just products of their time or their environment. So I'm going to tell you a little story featuring Marylin Monroe, but first, to make sure that we're both on the same page, let me give you the historical context. I'm sure that you're familiar by now with the large chunk of American history that was known as segregation, but in layman's terms, what segregation meant was that Black people and other people of color in the United States were barred, like legally prohibited, from entering what was considered whites-only establishments, and anything and everything that you can possibly think of that could be segregated was segregated. It wasn't until the 1954 Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education that a legal precedent was set that separation was inherently unequal. And it was another decade after that before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 federally outlawed segregation within businesses. Right, so we're talking about decades of American history with encouraged, because it was legal, discrimination against Black people. Now, if you're a fan of music, I'm sure that you've heard the name Ella Fitzgerald. She was one of the most incredible musicians in the entire world. If you have not heard that name, if you're unfamiliar, pause the video right here and go look her up. Are you back? Did you do it? If you looked her up, I'm sure that you saw what year Ella Fitzgerald was born. It was 1917. And I'm sure that you can guess where I'm going with this, but Ella Fitzgerald lived more than half of her life in a time period where she was legally barred from entering most establishments. This meant things like she could be hired as the talent to perform at a venue, but then also couldn't patronize that same venue. It's just another absolutely ridiculous display of white inferiority. But despite this, despite generations of this cumulative disenfranchisement and suppression, Ella Fitzgerald will go down as one of the greatest singers of all time. Ella Fitzgerald started performing in 1934, and by the early 50s, she had fans all across the country, including one specific fan who I'm sure you've heard of, who went by the name Marylin Monroe. She was known to spend hours and hours listening to recordings of Fitzgerald at the recommendation of her vocal coach, right? So Marylin Monroe was listening to Ella Fitzgerald in order to improve her own singing skill. Ella Fitzgerald was an incredible musician, and she already was that bitch before her and Marylin ever met. That's important to note. So Marylin Monroe hears Ella Fitzgerald perform live for the first time in 1954, and the two become friends, and they remained friends until they both eventually passed, with nothing but wonderful things to say about the other. But remember that history lesson we got earlier? It's 1954, so it's still going to be a whole other decade before the Civil Rights Act is passed. So with segregation still the law of the land, there were a lot of nightclubs that Ella Fitzgerald was simply never invited to perform at, never hired at. So Marylin Monroe, she finds this out, and she contacts the owner of a very popular LA nightclub called the Macombo. I hope I'm saying that right. But she contacts the owner of this nightclub, and she says that if he books Ella Fitzgerald as the talent in a spot that he had previously not booked her, that Marylin Monroe, that she would come every night and she would sit front of house. So the owner of this nightclub takes her up on it. He books Ella Fitzgerald, and Ella Fitzgerald's show sold out. Marylin does show up, she sits front of house, but her presence was not actually necessary to ensure a large turnout. Ella Fitzgerald was a packed house performer because of her own skill and talent. Remember, Marylin Monroe was only such a big fan because Marylin's music coach recommended she listen to Ella Fitzgerald to improve her own singing skills. Ella Fitzgerald was an established name. However, despite living in those times, Marylin Monroe was able to recognize the unequal treatment of Ella Fitzgerald in society and see what steps she could take to make sure that Ella was treated equally. It's not that Ella Fitzgerald needed a white savior to come in and uplift her into fame. She was already plenty famous. It is that Marylin Monroe had her foot in a door that Ella Fitzgerald was prevented from entering. But because Marylin was in those spaces, she was able to advocate for Ella Fitzgerald and amplify her voice. Behavior like Marylin Monroe's is evidence to me that regardless of what is normalized for a time period, there are people capable of acknowledging what is right and what is wrong, what is equal treatment and what is unfair and unequal treatment within society. And of course, the majority of society is going to want to normalize the dehumanization of the most exploited classes of people so that they can continue, right, to manufacture the consent of the general public to continue that exploitation, right? You don't care if someone's being exploited if you think they're all X, Y, and Z bad thing. But I take comfort in knowing that throughout every single period in history, you will find those who oppose that narrative, who will push back and who will stand up for what's right. So I tell you that story to remind you that your peepaws are capable of being spoken to about the way that bigotry affects others. And I think we do everyone a disservice when we write off people's behavior as being products of society. We are society. We make it up. So, white people, it's important for us to have these conversations in spaces where other people's voices might not be heard or even welcomed. God, it's such a cliche way to end this video, but be the change you want to see. That's it. That's the video.